Welcome to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, the podcast where insights and innovation meet. Every episode, we dive into conversations with industry leaders, experts, and change makers, bringing you the stories and ideas in the renewable energy sector that shape our world. And now, let's jump into today's episode with your host, Wes Ashworth. Welcome back to another episode of Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy. Today, we're diving into the world of energy storage with someone who has played a pivotal role in shaping its policy and market development. Joining me is Jason Burwen, Vice President of Policy and Strategy at GridStor. Jason has been at the forefront of the energy storage industry for nearly a decade, previously serving as VP of Energy Storage at the American Clean Power Association and as Interim CEO and VP of Policy at the U.S. Energy Storage Association. His advocacy has helped shape key policies, including the federal investment tax credit for energy storage and landmark market reforms like FERC Order 841. Today, we'll explore how energy storage is transforming the power grid, the biggest challenges in deploying storage at scale, and what's next for this fast-growing industry. Jason, welcome to Green Giants.
Thanks for having me, Wes.
Yeah, great to have you. So let's jump right in. I'd love for our listeners to hear a bit about your journey. How did you first get involved in the energy storage industry and what drew you to the field?
Yeah, I had wanted to be in energy policy really since graduate school, and I was very fortunate to, have a lot of support in learning about how power sector regulation works at the California Public Utility Commission. I moved over to Washington, D.C., really at the time where everyone was running away from Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
After the failure of the Waxman-Markey effort in 2009. And I joined a think tank called the Bipartisan Policy Center, where I had the energy innovation portfolio. And I was at BPC for, I think, around 3 years, just under. And the thing is, my job was focused on the pathways forward for new energy technologies in the mission of decarbonization. And every energy technology has its own politics, but as I looked at energy storage and batteries, something that kept occurring to me was, one, we absolutely need this. A world with more wind and solar is going to need a gobsmacking amounts of energy storage. Two, batteries are going to get cheaper faster than anyone expects because they're small, modular, mass-produced, just like solar panels, and no one's quite ready yet for that. And then the third, and probably the most compelling to me, was that at that time, there were already batteries being deployed on the American power grid, primarily providing fast frequency regulation in places like PJM, the Mid-Atlantic market, and in Texas. And it occurred to me, the trick for energy storage is not going to be getting a tax credit necessarily. It's about ultimately shaping how markets are designed and work, looking at regulations, because battery storage just doesn't look like any other thing on the system, but that its value is very clear from day one, even without any kind of incentive or subsidy with it. And that to me was a compelling political proposition for how this industry was going to advance, and that it could advance in a sort of nonpartisan or bipartisan way much faster. That's what precipitated my interest in joining the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking back to that, so when you first started in energy storage, what was the landscape like then? And how has it evolved to where we are today?
Yeah, when I joined, which would have been July of 2015, there was, I think, south of 300 megawatts across the entire United States. Again, as I said, nearly all of that providing fast frequency regulation. And, at that point in time, it was all independent power producers, right? Folks who had some ability to take merchant risk or merchant appetite. And also, it was a time when we could see that there was great potential, but there was also, everyone was kind of flying in all sorts of different directions, different technologies, different business propositions.
Yeah.
A lot of possibilities, but also not a ton of focus because the business model had really not been proven out at any great scale yet. And now, when I think about where we are today, one project is 300 megawatts, right?
Yeah.
The scale and scope of this industry is just multiple orders of magnitude greater. In 2020 was the first year that the industry achieved 1 gigawatt of annual installations.
Sure.
right after that went to multi-gigawatt years.
Yeah.
Now, I think 2024, the numbers, I'm pretty sure we broke 10 gigawatts. So that's a remarkable trajectory of growth across this industry. And everyone's a part of it now. Like, we don't have just IPPs. We have obviously very large utilities and load serving entities that are contracting for these assets. We have increasing interest now from large commercial industrial customers who see storage as a part of their portfolio they need in order to be able to come online and scale massive data centers, for example. So it's a real, I mean, I've felt very fortunate to be front row seat to this tectonic shift.
No kidding. It's exciting growth, and it's really amazing when you do look back at it over just a 10-year time frame, which is not a lot of time, you know, in the grand scheme of things when you look at development and just what it's come to today. How it's really kind of the center of everything. There's not many projects out there that don't have somehow storage tied to it in a way. I do want to put a little bit of this out there. So for those who may not be as familiar, can you break down the role energy storage plays in the renewable energy ecosystem? Why is it so crucial as we transition to cleaner energy?
Yeah, happy to do that. At its fundamentals, battery storage is about flexibility. And that's really important in energy systems that have higher degrees of complexity. So when you add lots of wind and solar to the system, for sure, the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And so in a very simple way, batteries or energy storage technologies generally are a means of making sure that you're decoupling the time of delivery of those assets from what the load needs, right? You're basically saying, I can now move energy across time using batteries to exactly when it's most valuable or most needed. The thing that I think folks also sometimes forget is that it's not just about the renewables, it's also about complexity in the system. So you have forecasting challenges associated with those assets. You have different interactions across the fleet as other resources need to ramp down or deal with that inflexibility in some way. And how you do that is very challenging when supply has to match demand at literally every moment, millisecond to millisecond, minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day. What battery storage does is, because you can sort of relax that constraint around matching exactly every given moment, because you have this great medium to store electricity, it allows you just a much wider range of operational possibilities and efficiencies on that power system. And so I think that's ultimately, sort of at a philosophical level, what battery storage is doing. In terms of what that looks like in the market, initially when batteries were much more expensive, they were providing very high value, short duration services. I mentioned frequency regulation, that kind of ancillary service that has a very short time frame. And they still do in many grids because they are faster responding than anything out there. You can respond to a frequency deviation in a quarter of a second.
Yeah.
And that's real value, right? That actually is incredibly valuable on a grid, particularly a grid with much higher levels of inverter-based resources. But also right now, the main value that folks are providing and selling battery storage on is to provide resource adequacy. That is to say, you are a part of the set of resources that are there to ensure that the grid has power every day, even the most high demand days of the year, and that the lights will always remain on, at least at the sort of bulk system level. And that's, those are typically right now in the United States. Obviously, this is a changing environment, but right now the convention is about 4 hours of duration at rated capacity. So we will see continued evolution, but really, I think that gives you a sense of what batteries are doing in the power system.
Yeah, no, great overview. I'm just thinking about it. So shifting gears a little bit to some of the impact in policy and market design and the roles that you've played there. So you've had a major influence on shaping energy storage policy, especially during time with the Energy Storage Association. How have wholesale electricity markets and power sector regulations impacted the growth of this industry?
Yeah, I think that when you look at where storage took off initially, it was places where you could sign long-term contracts, right? By and large. Maybe I should say, first, it took off in places where the market design was modified to value the fast response of the asset. So that was the fast frequency regulation markets of PJM and in Texas, the ERCOT market, right? The next markets were really these sort of long-term bilateral contracts with utility off-takers, where these assets were being presented as a part of as system reliability. And so the California utilities certainly signed a lot of those contracts, in large part because they were mandated to do so by California state policy. You saw, I think we're now at 11 states, maybe it's 12 states that have state policy goals or mandates for storage procurement of their utilities. And that's, we can argue about how much that exactly drove the market, but I think it created long-term demand signals that allowed a lot of businesses to invest in building teams and getting assets into interconnection queues and being ready to be built. And that's very impactful because these things take many years to come from conception to ultimate operations. But, a third thing that I think is important is that market designs certainly were shifted in the wake of Order 841, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's landmark order that required sort of the mainstreaming of energy storage into how markets work. And yet, I think that, when you look at current markets right now, you still see very sort of low levels of takeoff in the Eastern markets that have centralized capacity markets. And it's modest and growing in the central markets like MISO and the Southwest Power Pool, where, a lot of those assets are showing up paired and co-located, not as much standalone. In Texas, certainly, I think you've seen a massive growth recently, and that should be an important signal for everyone that what's happening in Texas is that you have now a price point for offering batteries and price signals that are telling folks to show up and invest in capacity, including battery storage, so that it can meet the periods of greatest demand as signaled by market prices. So ERCOT didn't change its market to do that, right? It's always been an energy-only market with this kind of a pricing action. It's changed around the edges. But what happened in Texas, and the reason why batteries have taken off there, is in part because the cost side of the equation has gotten low enough, and investors have really become much more comfortable with merchant risk and the ability to also get potential upside from offering these assets into merchant markets. So it's kind of a roving sense of what's been happening in the markets. But I think to sort of bring it all back together, you've always had to have some element of working on improving or updating market rules, market designs, regulations, because we still have a long way to go in this industry to really fully utilize the capabilities that energy storage has to offer.
Yeah, without a doubt. And something you briefly touched on there were some of the challenges around deploying standalone battery storage projects. What are some of those biggest hurdles you've encountered right now, whether regulatory or technical?
For standalone storage, it's a different thing than when you pair it with generation at the same site, right? When you pair it with generation at the same site, it's basically still generation with some greater degree of dispatchability, right? It doesn't get a whole lot more, it doesn't need necessarily a whole lot more complexity around it. Although we can talk about how it will get more complex. For standalone storage, because it's not a generator, you are going to be withdrawing energy off the grid and then resupplying it. At the outset, there are some grid operators for whom, they see this is certainly valuable because they have grids that have periods of excess energy, and it will be really important to have that energy on hand when it's more valuable. Certainly grids with large amounts of solar in them, the grid operators there see extraordinary value in doing this. There are other grid operators, though, particularly grids that don't necessarily have a lot of that sort of excess energy laying around, for whom they see that charging as being something that's a complicating factor, right? Because, prior to storage, you have load, which is, takes energy in, and you have generators, which sends energy out, and never twain shall those meet. And battery storage looks like both of those in one resource, right? And so the way in which you look at the charging behavior of storage is really a big part of how a lot of grid operators are thinking about storage, shaping rules around storage, and will ultimately affect the ability to deploy storage at scale in those regions where, for example, the rules are made much more stringent or unworkable in ways that have not been the case, for example, in the first markets, California and Texas, where battery storage has taken off. So that's one issue. Another issue that I think folks think about is capacity accreditation, which is kind of a wonky term, but it's basically means how much reliability value do you get credit for when
Sure.
you offer that resource? So, grid operators have to show a stack of resources that meet the sort of amount they need to show in order to be certified as having enough resources to keep the system reliable, resource adequacy. And what happens with storage is that its value for supplying reliability really is largely reflective of the supply mix and the load profile of the grid. It's not one thing. It's responsive and adaptive to that, right? And so as a result, the capacity accreditation of storage can move around a bit. And what we're seeing is that as grid operators move to, there's this modeling approach called effective load carrying capability, or ELCC. It's a dynamic measure that can change over time of the capacity contribution of energy storage resources. And I think that one of the challenges ahead is that for standalone storage, that value can change or decline with significant amounts of batteries or storage coming into the grid fairly quickly. Yeah. It can also go up. I mean, this is one of the things, right, is that you add a lot more, for example, solar to a power system. The value of that storage for supplying, for being a part of the resource adequacy mix goes up. So it's not, a single dimension here, but that change is something that's challenging to plan around for sure. As you think about, for example, whether it's long-term contracts for the offtake of that resource, or just the ability to understand what its future value might be. I think a lot of folks are responding to that, whether it's through different deal structures or starting to think about what kind of durations they need to deploy in order to be more future proof.
Yeah. Sticking on just storage and what's happening today, I know, there are a lot of challenges and hurdles and all of those things. Are there any recent breakthroughs or success stories I guess you'd like to share? What gives you hope or excites you about the current direction of the industry?
I mean, the fact that we just put 10 gigs down this past year or over, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me.
Yeah.
But, in 2024, more gigawatts of battery storage were deployed than wind or natural gas power plants. It's like, to me, that is a incredible sign of success. And the challenges that I discussed, these are the challenges of success, right? Like, these are good problems to have in a certain way. So I don't interpret these are challenges as like things are bad. It's just much more a sense that, the continued expansion of the industry, it's one thing when you're a young upstart going to prove to the world that you really are valuable. Yeah, we did that. Yep. Now we're joined the adults table, as it were, right? We're no longer at the kids table. And there are going to be growing pains that come along with that. But I think the fact that we've gotten there, and we've gotten there really fast, and that it's been something that continues to have broad support, both politically and the stakeholder interest in terms of power sector stakeholders, to me is a continuing sense of motivation to work on these issues, right? This is not something that is like, let's put it to the side because no one cares about it. I think this is really critical to the future of power systems everywhere still.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. And I do want to take a little bit of time just to address some misconception because they come up. There are a lot of misconceptions out there about battery storage. What's a common one I guess you encounter? How do you usually address it? For example, whether it's concerns about whether 4-hour batteries are reliable enough or any other thing that you come across.
So indeed, it's very obvious what the greatest constraint of a battery is, which is it runs out of power at some point, right? Or it runs out of energy. I know someone out there is going to ding me for saying you can't run out of power, you run out of energy. So to the pedantic people watching, don't worry, I heard you. I would say that, that's probably one of the most common concerns, particularly from policymakers, which is why would I rely on a 4-hour battery? I might have a longer outage. And the answer that we have to sort of educate with is like, well, you can think of that, but that's why we have power system planning. That's why we have whole sort of processes, whether it's a part of integrated resource planning or other kinds of system planning models, where what you do is you analytically go through and create scenarios based on the known mix of resources that you have under different stresses. And analytically, what you derive from that is an effective valuation of different durations. And when you do that, you realize, yeah, like 4-hour batteries are very valuable in most grids today because that's all you really need from them in reference to the rest of the supply mix, right, that they are a part of to provide reliability. Can it change over time? 100%. It can change over time. It will change over time. And the good news there also is that we're already beginning to see folks building longer and longer durations. I think you're seeing 6 and 8 hour systems now being announced, even if they're not yet built. But the key thing that I try to educate folks on here is that, this is why we do system planning. This is why we run power system modeling. It's about an analytical approach to a portfolio rather than thinking about, can this one thing in a vacuum meet this hypothetical scenario? Like, that's not how we plan our power systems.
Great point. The other thing, there are some studies out there or articles out there claiming that, battery storage can increase carbon emissions under certain circumstances. How do you respond to critiques like that? And what do people misunderstand about how storage interacts with the grid?
Yeah, we get like every 6 months, someone, usually from an academic unit, will publish research. Storage increases carbon emissions based on my models. And it's like, so again, let us remind folks, what these studies are typically finding is one of two things. Number one, battery storage has round trip losses, right? The amount of energy you put in is not the amount of energy that you get out, because in this world, we obey the laws of thermodynamics. And so from that alone, an analysis would say, oh, you're using more energy than you're delivering, and that loss can have a carbon emission associated with it. The other thing that these studies will typically find is, these batteries might be charging at a time of day when carbon intensive resources are dominating the mix, and then they're discharging at a time when they're competing with less carbon intensive resources, like charging from, let's say, coal in the supply mix, and then discharging at times when, say, gas is on the margin, right? And so they take sort of these two things together. They'll also usually show these batteries cycling in ways that are not typically done by market participants, and they'll come up with an analysis that says this much carbon emissions comes from these batteries. Oh no. And the thing to remember is a few things. One, like the whole round trip efficiency piece, like this is known and understood, and I don't think that that's in any way controversial. What is important to understand, particularly on the second piece, but it also implicates the first, is that battery storage or energy storage reflects the grid that it's in. As that grid becomes lower and lower carbon, the battery storage itself will, in fact, not only become lower carbon, but it'll amplify the reductions that are possible in that system, right? As, for example, you pull coal out of a system, well, the battery storage is no longer charging off of, say, a coal on the margin. It goes to a different resource that is maybe lower carbon, whether that's gas or renewables. And so, that's something to bear in mind here, is that the whole point of this is that when you look at these models, as you clean up the rest of the supply mix, the battery storage goes from being something that might entail carbon emissions to something that actually contributes to carbon reductions. And that's the whole point. We don't live in a static grid. Our grid is evolving and growing more and more decarbonized every year. And so as long as that trajectory remains, what batteries are doing is they're helping to integrate particularly large amounts of wind and solar, but more decarbonized resources. So it's fundamentally a part of the transition pathway to get to those resources. You need to have it on that system, and just recognize that over the lifetime of those assets, we will expect them to be net decreases in carbon. Absolutely. I can't remember, there was an analysis back in 2017 by Eric Hittinger where I think he did an analysis that showed that for every, I'm going to mess it up, but basically you only need a small amount of additional new renewables deployed to effectively net out the, small amount of carbon that would come from the deployment of those batteries in an existing system with some amount of fossil capacity on it. So don't worry, we will continue to clean up our grid, and that will take care of a lot of the problem with battery storage.
Yeah. Yeah, so well said. And such great points there. Transitioning a little bit to think about the future trends, outlook of the industry. As we've already covered, the energy storage market is growing rapidly and quickly. What do you see coming over the next decade? Are there trends or shifts that the industry should be preparing for?
I think that over the next decade, okay, a couple of things that occur to me. First is that we're going to see some of these technology pathways really succeed or not, right? So obviously lithium ion batteries have become the dominant technology and will remain so for some time. They're highly understood, reliable, perform the way they should. Everyone in the sort of financing and insurance ecosystem's familiar with them. That's surely the case, at least through the end of this decade and probably into the next. Question that I think is on a lot of folks' mind is, do we think that there are other technologies, competitor technologies to lithium ion batteries, things like sodium ion batteries, right, which are now being produced at scale, probably for the first time in China? Will that technology ultimately take off and supplant lithium ion batteries? There are technologies that are longer durations. They're not intended to compete with lithium ion batteries. So your listeners are probably very familiar with names like Form Energy, which is creating a sort of iron air battery. And there are a lot of other sort of technologies in the long duration landscape that seek to do sort of multi-day or at least many, many, many hours of duration. So it'll be interesting to see if those can get runway and actually take off, both technologically proving themselves, but also having a business model that can in fact allow them to scale. I think that's very exciting. I think that, as I mentioned, Texas has now got an enormous amount of batteries on its grid, and it's an energy only market. We are seeing now the arrival of structured offtake in that market because, heretofore, like the resource that provided hedges and various kinds of structured offtake were gas plants by and large. And now we have got all these batteries. And so a lot of retailers and other entities are coming to battery operators saying, can we buy a hedge? Can we do some sort of, structured offtake? And that's going to be a source of some real innovation. And I hope that what we see out of that is, much more sort of a track record of performance that allows folks to then use these kinds of mechanisms to continue financing and getting storage built without just doing a full, 100% tolled, long-term contract, which those are good too, to be clear, but we want to see a diversity of business models in this industry. And then, I think that there's going to be obviously a lot that needs to be done that's not specific to storage, things like interconnection and siting and permitting and just other matters that affect all of the various power sector industries. But the reason a lot of that matters for storage is because right now, this is when storage is matured and hitting its stride. And the challenges that we face today in things like interconnection, those are going to disproportionately impact the path of energy storage relative to things like wind and solar, which frankly matured many years earlier and are going to keep going at whatever speed they're going at. So I think that's something that gives me a little bit of pause is we have a lot of problems to solve right now. And the reason I get animated about them, even if they're not specific about storage, is that this is the moment for energy storage to scale rapidly. And the challenges to the whole power sector become ones that are borne by storage disproportionately.
Yeah, without a doubt. And something you touched on, California, Texas being early adopters of battery storage. They've also had those unique challenges. And thinking about that, what lessons can other states learn from their experiences, both positive and negative?
I mean, I think getting batteries onto your system and then getting some experience with them will make for more thoughtful regulation or market design discussions. There's a desire to try and sort of think out and solve a lot of things in advance of those assets showing up. And I get that. And in fact, that's something I think that can be quite useful to do. But it's also possible to go too far and not have the experience of actually operating those assets and seeing how they work and working with them before trying to figure out, okay, and this is how we're going to design these rules or processes. Again, on the issue of like charging, for example, that's a case in point, right? It's like the grid operators can take on some of that responsibility, figure out how to manage it, and then determine what they need to do rather than try to put rules and roadblocks up very early in the process. I would say also that the experiences of California and Texas are very divergent, right? California is a very policy-driven approach where there was a lot of state action to promote the industry. Texas is a very market-driven state where there's no policy in place, really, although there was early work by ERCOT to come up with sort of its own Order 841-like sort of set of rules and reforms. I would say that the reason batteries started showing up on Texas's grid is because of prices and having the ability to value and compensate resources for their flexibility that they could provide was what brought a lot of batteries into that system. So there's not one lesson because those are two very divergent pathways. I think the lesson, if anything, is that there's a lot of different ways to build and operate storage in a way that's going to make business sense. And we shouldn't expect that there's only one way to do this.
Right.
The other thing I'd also add is that I think that we have, some important work to do to continue to educate and make sure that places that don't necessarily have battery storage yet continue to see why this is a really valuable and important part of the grid. I think that, sharing the stories about how batteries help with system resilience have been a part of, both not just keeping the lights on as a regular part of resource adequacy, but the other things that they've done in terms of helping with reliability and resilience are things that you would expect would be widely valued across the grid. And it's just important to keep sharing those stories, particularly at a time when I think there's a lot of rising concern across the United States as more and more resources, not just storage, but really all sorts of power resources are being built at much larger scale. And folks are wondering, why is this coming here, right? We want to make sure that there's an understanding for why battery storage is an important part of the power grid, important part of system reliability, and something that folks should want to at least have around their region.
Yeah, no question. And thinking about too, just something you hit on earlier, which storage technology is always a hot topic, right? It's always something that I think is always buzzing around now. But sometimes, as you said, getting those innovations to market can be tough, and it is challenging. And big part of the solution, I guess. What are some of the overlooked challenges that new technologies face when trying to break into the market? And what are some of the solutions that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that the first and foremost is that it's hard to compete with the mainstream option right now. That's lithium-ion batteries. That's a moving target as well. So, you're not just competing against the value of it today, but its future value as well. And that's tough. You have to make sure that you're able to build a track record of performance so that even if your off-taker has signed an off-take contract with you, you need to be able to get financing. You need to be able to get insurance, have warranties associated with the performance of those assets. And that's tough. You need the customers to be able to get the track record. You need a track record to be able to get the customers, right? So how do you build that track record outside of like a demonstration or laboratory type of environment is really challenging. And that's where really close partnerships with, in this case, it's going to probably be utilities, right? That's what we're seeing, the sort of, whether it's Form Energy. I also know that ESS has created some partnerships with utilities for offtake and are presumably working very closely with them to make sure that they get an experience that is not just a science project, but like actually helps create the commercial basis for future sales, maybe not to that customer, but to other customers, right? You also have, you have to deal with a financing landscape that I would say that you're going to have a runway of various sorts, but you're going to be doing so at a time with a lot of change and ferment. And the market you think you're selling into is probably not the market that you're going to actually be selling into, whatever it is, 5-10 years out from now. And so in a certain way, there's just a lot of challenges with timing, right? There's been great ideas out there that were too early. And I'm sure there will also be great ideas that are too late. And there's just a certain degree of luck to this in terms of being at the right part of your technology development and maturation and commercialization when it makes sense to do so, and not in a macroeconomic environment or an industry environment, which is very risk averse or where investors are looking at much shorter horizons.
Yeah, a few more questions as we get closer to time, and I want to cover as much as we can. Just thinking about the industry leaders and policymakers and their ability to just better collaborate and accelerate the clean energy transition. What advice would you offer to those industry leaders or policymakers?
I'd offer two sets of advice, because if you're an industry person, I'd say, this industry is driven by policy, and you need to be able to engage with it effectively. It's not simply a matter of showing up to advocate, this is what I want. It's also a matter of being there day after day, year after year, working through the tough issues that, whether it's a grid operator like at an RTO or ISO, or a state regulator is dealing with, the old adage that, relationships drive politics is true in a lot of ways. And that's an important part for anyone who's trying to drive for the clean energy transition. You just can't parachute in and out. You have to be there for the longer haul and create those relationships. And then from the policymaker side, there's an enormous amount of value to, economic transition here, where we are building projects and industries that can provide enormous, not just immediate impacts to the power sector, but can also, whether it's employing folks, obviously, in skilled trades, whether it's creating know-how that can then go on to build future companies in the same or adjacent spaces. There's a reason why the United States has been so economically successful for so long.
Yeah.
And it's about embracing the technologies of the future and putting in the investments, private and public, to make sure that the US is where we continue to create a lot of value in those industries and sectors. And this is no different. Clean energy, we could call it clean, but a large part of clean energy is also energy that's produced here, and you don't have to rely on it coming from somewhere else, right? So I think that that's just something that I hope becomes a greater part of the conversation here. There's a lot of economic growth and, domestic reliability that you get from really leaning hard into the energy transition here.
Yeah, that's so good. Final question. Any just final thoughts, key messages you'd like to share with our audience? Anything we missed, whether it's about the future of energy storage or otherwise?
I encourage folks to really, if you're not already up on what's happening in battery storage, to really pay close attention here, because this is such a fast growing and fast moving industry. There's a lot of good stuff to do out there, but I'm always grateful when really smart and motivated people show up in the battery storage industry, having come from other places. And I don't know who's listening to your podcast right now, but if you're coming from an adjacent space, finding your way into this exciting sector is something that I certainly encourage you to do, because we need you. We need all these great folks, whether you're coming from renewables, whether you're coming from gas or other fueled power sources, whether you're coming from outside the power system and you're in software and you're doing algorithms or AI. All of that makes a lot of sense in this space. There's a place for you here.
I love that. Just great closing thoughts there. And I couldn't agree more. Something I'm personally very, very passionate about is trying to draw the best talent from other industries in. And I think we need all of those individuals and talented individuals to make this work. So I love that. So with that, it brings us to the end of today's conversation with Jason Burwen, VP of Policy and Strategy at GridStor. Jason, thanks so much for sharing your deep insights on energy storage, policy, and the future of grid resilience. To our listeners, as always, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with your network, and stay tuned for more discussions with the innovators shaping the clean energy transition. And with that, we'll see you soon.
This episode of Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, was brought to you by Lee Group Search. If you enjoyed today's discussion and are looking to recruit top talent for your company or find your next career opportunity in the renewable energy sector, visit leegroupsearch.com. Let's continue driving the future of clean energy together. Until next time, keep pushing toward a greener future.